The night smelled of smoke and destiny, the kind of air that clung to a man's lungs and made him believe history itself was about to take a breath. The small town of Lexington lay asleep beneath a silver moon when a horse's hooves shattered the silence. The rider, cloak whipping in the wind, carried a message that would change the course of a continent. "The regulars are coming," he shouted into the darkness, and in that echo began the birth of a nation. Among the sleeping houses, a young man named Samuel Carter stirred. He was 21, a blacksmith's apprentice, his hands rough with iron and his heart raw with dreams of liberty. He had heard whispers for months of taxes, tyranny, and rebellion, but that night the whispers became thunder. His father, once a proud subject of the crown, had warned him never to meddle in politics. "The king feeds us, the king protects us," he'd said. But Samuel had seen the hunger, the soldiers quartered in homes, the fear in every shopkeeper's eyes when redcoats passed by. Now, as the sound of the horse faded down the road, he felt the weight of choice pressing on his chest. Outside, the bells began to ring, one after another, calling the men of Lexington to arms. Muskets were pulled from mantles, powder horns filled, prayers whispered into trembling hands. Samuel ran into the street barefoot, his breath white in the cold April air. He saw Captain John Parker, a man whose face seemed carved from the same stone as the churchyard, gathering the militia on the green. "Line up, men. We stand for our rights tonight." Parker's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the truth. None of them were ready for what was coming. In the distance, torches flickered like fireflies in a storm. The British column was marching. Drums beat, feet struck the ground in perfect rhythm, and the red of their coats burned against the dawn. Samuel's heart pounded. He had never fired a musket in anger, never faced an enemy. He looked at the faces beside him, farmers, tailors, fathers, and wondered how freedom could depend on such ordinary men. Then the first shot came, sharp and lonely, no one knew from where. A puff of smoke drifted over the green. A British officer shouted, a musket flashed, and chaos broke loose. The Battle of Lexington had begun. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. The British moved on toward Concord, leaving behind silence and blood. Samuel knelt beside his fallen friend Jacob, the boy he had grown up with, and felt something inside him break and harden at once. That was the moment he stopped being a blacksmith's apprentice and became a patriot. He didn't return home. Instead, he followed the trail of the British, musket in hand, fury in his veins. Along the road, more men joined, farmers abandoning their plows, boys leaving their mothers in tears. The countryside erupted in resistance. From every town and farm, bells rang and drums sounded. By the time they reached Concord, hundreds of colonists had gathered. The British searched for hidden munitions, unaware that they had become the hunted. Behind stone walls and trees, the militia took aim. When the British began their march back to Boston, the Americans struck from every shadow. The long retreat turned into a nightmare of gunfire and smoke. Samuel fired until his musket barrel burned his hands. He saw redcoats fall and rise again, the lines breaking, the proud army of the king harried by men in homespun coats. By nightfall, the British reached the safety of Boston, but the world had changed. The colonies were no longer afraid. Word spread like wildfire through Massachusetts, then New York, then Virginia. The news reached Philadelphia, where men with powdered wigs and restless eyes debated the meaning of liberty. Samuel, exhausted and filthy, reached Cambridge, where the militia was gathering under a tall Virginian officer named George Washington. He watched Washington ride through the camp, calm, commanding, a man who carried both patience and power in his bearing. When Washington spoke, even the wind seemed to listen. "Gentlemen," he said, "we do not fight for revenge, nor for chaos.
We fight so that every man may govern himself. This is no rebellion. It is the birth of freedom." Samuel felt fire in his blood. He enlisted that day in the Continental Army. The months that followed were hard, beyond imagining. Food scarce, uniforms ragged, nights cold enough to freeze breath midair. Yet through hunger and despair, they held on. Washington's army was a ghost force, poorly armed, badly fed, but rich in one thing the British would never understand: conviction. Samuel wrote to his mother once saying, "We have no shoes, no tents, but we have faith, and that seems to keep us alive." In Boston, they dug trenches, aimed their few cannons, and waited. When the British evacuated in 1776, the cheers shook the harbor. But victory was fleeting. Across the colonies, the war spread like wildfire. In New York, defeat followed defeat. Samuel saw men die by the hundreds, their dreams buried in mud and smoke. But Washington did not yield. On a freezing December night, Samuel crossed the Delaware River beside him, ice cracking beneath our boots, faces numb from wind. They struck at Trenton before dawn, surprising the Hessians in their sleep. The victory was small, but it lit hope like a candle in the dark. Through battles and winters, through hunger and loss, Samuel grew from boy to man, his faith forged in the furnace of war. He saw betrayal and heroism, cowardice and courage, and learned that freedom was not a gift, but a burden carried by those willing to bleed for it. The war dragged on. Saratoga, Valley Forge, Yorktown, each name etched into memory, each sacrifice a stone in the foundation of a new world. Samuel lived to see the British surrender, to watch the flag of 13 stars rise over a nation born in pain and belief. When peace finally came, he returned to Lexington, a town rebuilt, the scars of war softened by time. Standing on the green where it had all begun, he whispered to the wind, "We were ordinary men, but we made an extraordinary country." And as the sun rose over the quiet fields, the air once again smelled of smoke and destiny.
But peace, as Samuel soon learned, was not silence. The guns had fallen quiet, yet the echoes of war lingered in every broken fence, every empty chair at the supper table, every scar on the land and the people who had survived it. The revolution had ended, but the nation it had birthed was still an infant, fragile and restless. Samuel returned to the forge where he had once hammered iron for horseshoes and plows, and now he found himself shaping nails for homes that would rise where ashes had been. Yet every strike of his hammer felt different, as though each spark carried the weight of the liberty they had fought for. The village of Lexington was quieter now, but beneath that calm lay uncertainty. Men argued in taverns and churchyards about what this new country should become. Some said it should remain a collection of independent states, free from any distant authority, while others believed it needed a strong center, a union that could protect what had been won with blood. Samuel listened more than he spoke, but in his heart he knew that freedom without unity was only the shadow of liberty. He often thought of Washington, who had returned to Mount Vernon but was never far from the thoughts of those who had served under him. The general had been their guide through chaos, and now, as the 13 states bickered and stumbled, his name returned again and again in the murmurs of the people, like a prayer half whispered and half hoped. The war had taught Samuel that victory was never final, and that peace itself was another battlefield fought with words instead of bullets. Taxes, trade, borders, these new arguments felt strangely familiar. Once they had resisted the tyranny of a distant king. Now they wrestled with the tyranny of their own divisions. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt to bind the states, proved too weak. Samuel saw it in the faces of farmers crushed by debt, in the anger that spread through Massachusetts during the rebellion led by Daniel Shays.
The cries of those men reminded him of the days before Lexington, when injustice had once again driven ordinary men to arms. But this time it was not against the British, it was against their own government. Samuel could not bring himself to take sides. He had seen too much of war to believe that gunfire could ever rebuild what gunfire had once destroyed. He wanted something different now, something that could last longer than muskets and memories. When he heard of a great convention to be held in Philadelphia, where delegates from every state would gather to forge a stronger union, he felt the same stir in his heart that he had known years before on the Green. He was no scholar, no statesman, but he knew that history was moving again, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. He traveled south, through dusty roads lined with new farms and towns still smelling of fresh timber. America was growing before him like a living thing, raw and uncertain, its people bound together by nothing more than hope and exhaustion. In Philadelphia, he saw faces that had become legends: Benjamin Franklin, aged but sharp as ever; Alexander Hamilton, speaking with the energy of 10 men, and Washington himself, presiding with quiet authority. Samuel could not enter the hall, but he lingered outside the State House, listening to the echoes of debates that drifted through the windows. Words like liberty, union, and justice floated into the summer air, heavy with meaning. He realized that the revolution was not over, it had only changed its shape. The battle for independence had been fought with muskets. The battle for identity was being fought with ideas. When the Constitution was finally signed, he felt a weight lift from the land, as if the soil itself had decided to believe in tomorrow. But not everyone agreed. In taverns and public squares, men argued over the power of the federal government, the rights of states, the balance between freedom and order. Samuel heard their anger, but he also saw something deeper, a people learning to
Argue without killing each other, learning that liberty meant not silence, but the right to speak, to differ, to build. The years rolled forward like an unbroken river. Washington became the first president, and when Samuel heard the bells ring to celebrate his inauguration, he stood on the same green where the first shot of war had been fired. The circle felt complete, yet he knew it was only the beginning. The nation was alive now, breathing through the hearts of millions, imperfect and uncertain, but alive. He saw the rise of towns where there had once been battlefields, the laughter of children who would never know the sound of cannon fire, and the slow return of trust between those who had once been enemies. He married a woman named Anna, a nurse who had tended the wounded during the war, and together they built a small home on the outskirts of Lexington. The forge burned bright again, its fire reflected in his son's curious eyes. Samuel taught him to shape metal, but more than that, he taught him what it meant to shape a country, to take what was broken and make it stronger than before. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he would tell stories of the war, of the fear and the courage, of Washington's calm voice in the snow, and of the morning the world changed on the Lexington Green. His son would listen wide-eyed, asking, "Was it worth it, Father?" And Samuel would pause, staring into the fire, seeing faces long gone, and answer softly, "Freedom is never finished, son. It must be hammered every day, just like the iron on this anvil." As years passed, the old wounds of war faded into memory, but new challenges arose, arguments over expansion, over slavery, over the meaning of equality. Samuel grew older, slower, but he never lost faith. He believed that what they had begun in 1775 was a promise that each generation must renew. When he finally stood again on the Lexington Green, his hair white, his hands scarred, he looked toward the horizon and saw not soldiers, but children playing. The grass had grown over the blood, the earth had forgiven, and the wind carried only laughter. He smiled, feeling the peace that men like him had fought so hard to earn. The revolution, he thought, had never really ended.
It had simply moved into the hearts of those who still believed that a man could be free. And as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the field, Samuel Carter, once a blacksmith's apprentice and a soldier of liberty, closed his eyes and felt the world settle into the quiet rhythm of a dream fulfilled, knowing that somewhere, across the wide, restless land, the flame of freedom still burned, waiting to be tested again.
Small, it was restless, ambitious, a land of motion. Wagons rolled west, rivers carried dreams, cities rose where forests had stood, and with them came new divisions that freedom alone could not mend. In the north, factories filled the air with smoke and noise. In the south, fields of cotton stretched endless beneath the sun, tended by hands that did not share in the liberty Samuel had fought for. Jonathan's heart often wrestled with the contradiction. He had been taught that all men were created equal, yet he knew that in half the country, men were chained by law and profit. When travelers came north from Virginia or Georgia, he would listen quietly as they spoke of slaves and crops, of commerce and comfort, and wonder if the revolution had stopped halfway. He married a woman named Clara, whose laughter softened the edges of his doubts, and together they had a son, David, born in 1824, the first Carter to open his eyes in a century that promised both wonder and ruin. By then, the world had changed beyond what Samuel could have imagined. Steamships ruled the rivers, railroads cut through wilderness, and messages traveled faster than horses. But progress, Jonathan knew, was never free. The same passion that had united the colonies was now tearing the country into pieces of belief and fear. He saw it in newspapers that screamed of abolition and rebellion, in sermons that turned into arguments, in neighbors who stopped speaking over lines drawn by conscience. When Samuel died, old and peaceful, Jonathan stood over his grave and whispered, "Father, we won the war, but we're still learning how to live with victory." Years passed, and David grew tall and curious, with a hunger not for battle, but for meaning. He loved books more than tools, words more than weapons. Yet in his time the air itself seemed charged again, just as his grandfather had described before the first revolution. The debate over slavery had become a storm, and every gust carried anger enough to set fire to the Union. David studied law in Boston, where the city pulsed with speeches and protests. He listened to orators who spoke of freedom for all men, black and white, and to others who warned that such talk would destroy the nation. He thought of Samuel's stories, of the musket smoke and the blood on the Lexington Green, and wondered whether history was a circle instead of a line. When he returned home, he found Jonathan older, slower, but still steady in his work. The forge still glowed each morning, though fewer farmers came now, more machines doing what hands once had. Father and son often sat in silence, each feeling the weight of the age pressing upon them. When news came of new territories, of Kansas and Nebraska, of votes and violence, Jonathan said quietly, "Freedom's an anvil, David. Every generation must strike it, or it cools and dies." And David understood. When the war finally came, when brother turned against brother, and the land itself seemed to tear apart, David was 37. He had a wife, a small child, and a promise to keep the family forge alive. Yet he could not ignore the call of conscience. He enlisted not for glory, but for the belief that the unfinished work of Samuel's age must at last be completed. The army he joined was different from his grandfather's ragged band. It was larger, louder, clothed in blue, but its purpose was the same, to make liberty real. The battles were monstrous now, fought with iron and fire beyond anything the Revolution could have imagined. At Antietam, at Gettysburg, he saw the fields turn red again, the soil drinking freedom's price once more. In letters to his wife, he wrote not of victory, but of endurance,
of holding the line so that his son might never see what he had seen. We are still fighting Father's war, only the weapons have changed. When the war ended, and Lincoln's voice was silenced by a single shot, David returned home with hair turned gray before its time. The Ford stood cold, untouched since the day he left. He lit it again, slowly, the flames trembling like the new nation's pulse. His father, Jonathan, was gone by then, but his words lived in the rhythm of the hammer. Each strike was a prayer that America might finally learn what freedom truly meant. Not just the right to speak or vote, but the courage to see others as equal souls. His son Thomas watched him work, eyes wide with the same quiet fire that had burned through 3 generations. David never spoke much of the war, only of what must come after, the rebuilding, the forgiving, the endless forging. A country, he told Thomas one evening, is not built once, but again and again, each time we remember who we are supposed to be. The century turned slowly, the scars of the past softening, but never vanishing. New voices rose, of women demanding their place, of immigrants seeking belonging, of workers calling for fairness. The republic that Samuel had helped ignite had become vast and wild, its promise stretched across a continent, but its heart still beat with the same uncertain rhythm. And somewhere in the quiet town of Lexington, the Carter Forge still glowed, the metal singing under the hammer, sparks rising like stars from earth to sky, carrying with them the unending story of a people still learning the meaning of freedom.